Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Parker, and I'm the Director for the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia. And you're here today with Dr. Barbara Howe, who will do a really exciting and interesting presentation about Dr. Emory Kemp. And so she'll go into detail about that, but I'll tell you a little bit about Barb before we get started. So Barb has a PhD in history from Temple University, and she worked as the regional preservation officer for the Ohio Historic Preservation Office for several years before moving over to WVU to direct what is now the Public History program in the Department of History. So she directed the Public History program for almost 20 years, and then became a full-time director of the Center for Women's Studies until retirement in May 2009. So just a little bit more information about what to do for the webinar. If you have any questions throughout Barb's presentation, you can submit those either through the chat option or the questions option. I'll also be sharing 2 links in the chat option that direct you to Dr. Kemp's materials that are available online. So please feel free to share those and access those. And for anyone that you want to share this with later on, we'll be adding it online as well through the PAWV website and YouTube channel. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Barbara Howe. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy our discussion for today.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. It is my pleasure to talk about my neighbor and friend and colleague and co-worker, Emory Kemp. And I have expanded the title a little bit to include transportation history, because those of you who had the pleasure of knowing and working with Emory know that he was a bridge man. And so transportation is important. So Emory passed away in January of this year, and you'll see the little cartoon that I used in the title slide and here, and that's my little design motif for the webinar, and I think you can see the resemblance between the cartoon figure, which a student did in the early 1980s, and I can't remember who did it, so if there's anybody on this webinar who can tell me who the artist was, the family and I would very much like to know that. So here's my outline, a lot to cover in 45 minutes. A brief biography, his work in Wheeling, Custom House Suspension Bridge, Society for Industrial Archaeology, Covered Bridges, Historic American Engineering Record, other documentary techniques, with films, drawings, photography, photogrammetry, a couple of smaller projects, Little Kanawha and Blaker's Mill, the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology, publications, then his records, which refer to the links Danielle's going to send you, some honors and obituaries, and then I do want to recognize the people who are carrying on this work. So Emory was born on October 1st, 1931. He went to the University of Illinois Laboratory High School. Most of us don't talk about our high schools very much, but Emory always talked about Uni High. Got a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering as the outstanding civil engineering graduate that year at the University of Illinois. Went to London on a Fulbright to get a diploma from the Imperial College of Science and Technology, and then a master's in engineering at the University of London, and then decided he probably needed to know more math and came back to Illinois for a PhD in structural mechanics. While he was in London, so this is before he gets his PhD, he's working for a variety of engineering companies, including OVRHC in London, a firm that is still in business. And because this is the Commonwealth, he is working on projects around the world. There's a staircase in Nigeria, I think, for some public building that he designed. But the most important one was the specifications for the roof of the Sydney Opera House. Jorn Utzon, who was the architect, drew some lines on a napkin. This is the way Emory tells the story, gave it to Arup. Arup never thought there was something that couldn't be built if you had the right people, and Emory was one of the right people. So again, before he gets his PhD, he is designing the Opera House. He could have had the job as resident engineer of the Opera House, but decided to get a PhD. Now I think I want to introduce Janet here. They were married in 1958, and throughout Emory's career, Janet has been there making sure everything happened right. And for those of us who worked with him, we always had a saying of who's going to play Janet on this project to make sure it gets done. So this is probably one of the last pictures of the two of them from last spring. His career at WVU, he starts off as an associate professor of civil engineering with tenure. If you know the academic system, you know that nobody with a brand new PhD comes in as an associate professor with tenure, but Emory did, to set up the structural engineering program. And so he was then chair of the Department of Civil Engineering, decided he didn't want to be chair anymore, went to Oklahoma for a year to look at their History of Science and Technology program, founds our program, and in 1989 is the founder and director of the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology. I want to start with his projects in Wheeling because shortly after he comes to West Virginia, he gets involved in projects in Wheeling. And he works very, very closely with Beverly Flutie throughout many, many decades until Beverly passes away in 2009. I love this photo of them at a Preservation Alliance meeting in Wheeling about 1983. One of his projects was with the Wheeling Custom House. Now, you all know it as West Virginia Independence Hall. He always thought it was the Custom House because that's why it was built. And because Wheeling, you could clear customs at Wheeling because of its role on the National Road, Ohio River, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So everyone could get to Wheeling easily enough. Here he is with Beverly, looking at old photos, and Francis Pierpont, the governor of the restored government of West Virginia, is in the background there. And Emory's role with the Custom House was really this 9-inch rolled iron beam. And this is now at the Custom House. We sent it up to them this winter after he died. We have a video of him explaining this, and Danielle is trying to get that loaded on to YouTube, and she will send you the link. The key is that foundries could roll a beam like this with one flange, either the one at the right or the one at the left, but it took them a very long time to be able to figure out how to roll both flanges. And when they did, they used these in the construction of the Custom House. Emory's role was to prove that the building could accommodate a higher load limit on the floors than was originally determined. So in order to get the building open to the public, you had to know how many people could be in it safely. And he did the calculations on this beam that showed that the weight limit could be higher than expected. He also was enamored by suspension bridges. Unfortunately, the one publication that he never finished was to be a definitive history of suspension bridges from the French system, with Janet as the translator of the French, through the Chinese, English, American, wherever. But he was particularly worked on the Wheeling suspension bridge, which Charles Ellett designed in And then redesigned. And in the early 1980s, Emory was very much involved in the restoration of the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. So here's one of the pictures of that restoration effort. And he was very proud of this picture with Jean's daughter, Susie, up on top of the suspension bridge. He loved that Susie was about 10 at the time. Many of you will know Jean through her work in preservation in Wheeling. Here's another view of Emory showing off the suspension bridge. And to students, this neoprene wrapping was one of the things put on in the early 80s that did not work. And the restoration was, when it was redone, they took that off and wrapped it with wire. In 1988, Emory brought the Society for Industrial Archaeology to Wheeling and worked on this Wheeling Port of Entry industrial guide to the sites that Elizabeth Nolan, now Elizabeth Pickett, edited, and many of us contributed to that. And on the left, you'll see from the SIA newsletter, two heroes of the Wheeling Conference, Emory and his bridge. And at the bottom, people gathered at the Custom House where we had meetings. And here they are at the admiring masses. You'd better admire the suspension bridge if you went with Emory. He was also very interested in covered bridges, and this is a brochure that we did with the Humanities Council, which we distributed through the state welcome centers to promote the interest in covered bridges in the state. And that's where they were in 1987. I'm sorry, let me go back one. So in the early 80s, Emory was very involved with surveying the bridges of the state, over 4,000 of them for the West Virginia Department of Highways. And if you were on the webinar last week, you learned about a very high-tech way of surveying many, many buildings by entering entering information into a computer database on the laptop as you drove around town, around the county. Well, Emory's high-tech system was to take key punch cards, as you'll see here, an old-fashioned way of dealing with computers, and a knitting needle type thing. It probably was one of Janet's knitting needles, and punching holes in the cards. And there were 4,000 bridges, and they put these cards in a shoebox, and you ran the needle through holes and picked it up, and then you picked up all the cards that had that particular characteristic, like the county or the bridge type or the truss type or the age or whatever it is that he was calculating. I do not know if all the cards are at the West Virginian Regional History Center, but I had to borrow some cards years ago from a friend in business and economics because everyone I knew who ever used these cards had thrown them away a long time ago. So that was the early 80s system of the system that was used down in McDowell County. One of his covered bridge restoration projects for the state was at Dents Run, which is outside Morgantown. You can see it under construction. The most important thing to a covered bridge you learn from Emory is the truss system. The walls and the roof are just there to protect the truss system and the deck. So they can be taken down and replaced, but you'd better make sure you protected the truss system. Of course, his most famous covered bridge project was at Philippi. And you can see the original covered bridge in the picture in the lower left. And some of us will remember that in February of 1989, the Philippi Bridge caught on fire. A vehicle drove across and gasoline was trailing out of it, and there was a spark and the bridge went up in flame. And Governor Caperton at the time called up Emory and asked him to be in charge of the restoration of the Philippi Bridge. His philosophy was repair whatever we can, replace when we must. And this reopened in September of 1991. Now, what you see now is the plastic cover that he built and designed over the bridge. The tent is from a blue and gray day. That's not part of the restoration. But here they are inside the tent looking at the bridge restoration work. And here you can see the new bridge materials, the lighter color and the charred members that are in black. And one of the things that they did that was so important on this was to use epoxy to fill in the burnt members wherever possible. You might be able to see on the lower right here where there looks like there's some epoxy mixed in with the original burnt material, or here's some new chimed in or some new that's gone in with the old. I seem to recall they used ground walnut shells to try to get the epoxy to a color that would be appropriate. So that's inside the bridge. And you can see on the top photo the new siding that's been put on, again inside that plastic house, and the bridge now as it stands on the bottom. So this was an enormous effort with a lot of publicity because it's such an important bridge to the state. He's also been involved in moving bridges. This is the Stats Mill Bridge that is now at the Cedar Lakes Conference Center. It was moved about 3 miles away from Ripley for a flood control project. One of Emory's most important projects in the state also, well, they're all important, but this was with the Historic American Engineering Record, which is part of the Park Service, the Department of the Interior. It was established in 1969. Many preservationists know about the Historic American Building Survey, which goes back to the 1930s to put out-of-work architects to work and documenting the most important buildings in the country at the time through photography and measured drawings. HAIR is the equivalent of that for industrial and other engineering structures. There were 94 West Virginia projects through February of 2020. Emory was the advisor on 16 of them. 14 were done by the Institute of History and Technology and Industrial Archaeology staff, and 87 of the photos that we could identify were his. So very few states have been documented, I think, as well as West Virginia through the HAIR project because of Emory's leadership. This is a partial list of the projects where he was an advisor. So they go from Ohio County, of course, the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, the B&O, he loved the B&O, Easton Roller Mill over to Jefferson County, Barrackville Covered Bridge, more B&O railroad companies, Richard Coke Ovens, Bridgeport Lamp Chimney, Imperial Carbon Black Plant, all kinds of places all over the state. Here's an example of a HAIR drawing. This would be a cover sheet for the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. So you have a drawing, you have a map placing it, and then you have text. And this is another drawing from the suspension bridge showing the cable system and the stays as they work across the tower on the suspension bridge. One of his other early projects was the endless wire petroleum pumping operation in the Volcano area. There's virtually nothing of this left now, but this was a very, very early oil and gas pumping system in West Virginia. Here's one of the drawings from Volcano from the endless wire system. And so you can see the wires coming across the wheels, going down across wheels, going up, and then going back out again as they're pumping. And this is the Imperial Carbon Black Plant Storage Building in also near Volcano, actually. This plant made carbon black for things that are so antique now as carbon paper and typewriter ribbons. This is one of Emory's photos. He also did photography down at Nuttleberg for the Park Service as part of the New River National River. The Nuttleberg coal tipple you can see on the map on the left as it looks on Google Earth, and as his photograph shows. It looks much better on Google Earth, but there's not a lot of it left. This is the crew that did the Nuttleberg photography: Kevin McClung, Janet Emery, Lee Maddox, and Joel. That's what industrial archaeologists usually look like, by the way. He also did 2 films for the Park Service. As far as we know, those are the only films that were ever done for the Park Service and hair. And one of them was coke making in beehive ovens that was done in 1973 in Brett's. And you can see the photograph on the left. Many of these photographs, I should note, were done by Bill Barrett, his longtime friend who lived over in the Eastern Panhandle area, as I recall. If you're on the Deckers Creek Rail Trail in Morgantown, you might bike by the site of the coke ovens, but the last ones we know were demolished by March of 2016. This film is available from the WVU libraries. The other one that he did was on Seneca glass here in Morgantown. And you can see the hair drawing of Seneca glass on the left, showing the furnace room, and then the photograph that somewhat corresponds with that, and the location of it. This film is also available at the WVU library. Seneca glass closed down in 1983. It's now a shopping center, by the way. So the building is still there. So one of the things you had to learn with Emory, because he was doing measured drawings, is to do measured drawings yourself. I expect he found it rather frustrating to try to teach students, history students, how to do measured drawings, but note the yardstick. And I think that's Kate Mahood measuring the building at the old stone house in Morgantown. And then, of course, you took those measurements and put them on paper and created a drawing. I do have a photo somewhere of Emory helping Kate get up on that windowsill, but couldn't find that one. We did a number of projects together in terms of documenting buildings. One was at the Sites Homestead for the Forest Service at Seneca Rocks. And this building you can see in the upper left was in very, very bad shape in the 1980s when Jan Brashler, then the archaeologist for the Forest Service, asked us to do a history of the site and to document it. So that's what it looked like when the Forest Service started working on its history. Emory loved the large format photography, and you can see him barely hidden under his black cloth for his camera here, taking photos at the site's homestead. This is the kind of camera that was used for the hair photographs. And as a result of our history work and a lot of other public and family pressure, the Forest Service has restored the building, and this is what it looks like now. He was also experimenting with close-range photogrammetry. We had a project with the Corps of Engineers in the early 80s at the Bulltown Historic Area in Braxton County. And the Cunningham House was one that the Corps of Engineers owned. It was not in very good shape. It was occupied, but it was not in very good shape. And Emory decided that this would be a good time to practice close-range photogrammetry so that he could use that in terms of developing a restoration plan. So you'll see the targets on the building on the left, these little white things pointing here and here. The camera takes those pictures, prints them out, and then this is Emory's version of the work that needs to be done. On the building, he was very concerned that the stone that were underneath the porch were not, in fact, holding up the pillars. You can see on the left that the stones are not underneath the pillars. That was one of his big concerns on the structure of the porch. But you clean up the drawing and it looks like this with instructions for the contractors. You'll see that he has moved the stones underneath the pillar. So rebuild the rafters, the ridge, the purlins, and install a standing seam roof. And this is the building today on the left, which is part of the Bulltown Historic Area with the Corps of Engineers. Two of his other smaller projects, this one at the Little Kanawha Navigation Works near Elizabeth, where he is working with Larry Seipolt. On the left, one of his longtime colleagues and friends through the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology. And they're photographing this, and we'll be writing that up. Then in the 80s also, we worked with Jackson's Mill. He and I were very involved in projects with the history of Jackson's Mill at the State 4-H camp. And Extension Service was given Blaker's Mill on the left in its original location in Alderson. I think the man's name was Robert Blaker, as I recall, who then owned it. Didn't really want it anymore. It was taken down and moved up to Jackson's Mill. So from the lower Blue Arrow up to the upper Blue Arrow, and re-erected at Jackson's Mill, where it is now an operating mill. As I mentioned earlier, Emory founded the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology in 1989. Part of WVU, was headquartered at the Vance Farmhouse here on the Mile Ground in Morgantown. They had a lot of external contracts, worked very closely with the Park Service, had a lot of funding through Representative Alan Mollahan. I want to give Congressman Alan Mollahan a lot of credit. He and Emory were great partners. Alan would find the money and Emory would do the project through things like the Vandalia Foundation, the Institute, and in other ways. So that was a really wonderful partnership that employed a number of people at WVU and did projects around the state and elsewhere. So he was also an author. If you go to West Virginia, you will see these articles that Emory did on bridges, of course. Frank McIntyre was a bridge builder, built one of the bridges in Clarksburg, I know. Weston and Gauley Bridge Turnpike was a project that Emory did for the Corps of Engineers with Janet that ran from Weston to Gauley Bridge and through the area that is the Bulltown Historic Area. And of course, the Suspension Bridge. So here's just one of his examples of an article from West Virginia. He also published widely. Here are a number of his books. The Industrial Archaeology book, I think, is one that is probably the only one that's been done. Was done as part of Krieger Publishing Company's Public History series with a series of articles on techniques for industrial archaeology. The essays on the history of transportation and technology that WVU Press did was kind of his own Festschrift. Usually a Festschrift in academia is essays people put together to honor someone. Well, these are his own essays that he collected and the University Press published. Then the Great Kanawha Navigation Work and Taming the Muskingum in Ohio. There are a couple of articles that were written about Emory in the past few years. This one is from wonderful West Virginia. It is available online if anyone is interested in that. I did one in Golden Seal on him with thanks to Stan Bumgardner, the editor of Golden Seal and a former student. He even merited a Wikipedia entry I don't know who wrote the original one. I um, updated it with his death date, but I don't know who wrote the original one. And here is a reference to his papers. You'll see the link below that Danielle will send you as an active link. This is an enormous collection. He had been, it says something like 1735 to 2020. Well, of course, Emory was a student of the British Industrial Revolution. You had to learn the Industrial Revolution started in Britain. And so these are his research files for the history of suspension bridges, for everything that he was doing throughout his career. There is more. Right before COVID-19 shut down everything, Janet and I were contacting the West Virginia Regional History Center to see if they wanted anything else. And they shut down before they could really answer. But there is more. So if you go to his papers, there are a series of research files. That's 1735. Kemp, his library, he had an extensive library on the history of engineering, his professional writings, his other professional responsibilities. He was the president of the Society for Industrial Archaeology. He was the president of the Public Works Historical Society. He was one of the founders of the Preservation Alliance. So there were many, many professional opportunities. He was the chair of a committee for the American Society of Civil Engineers, very involved in getting them to recognize civil engineering landmarks through ASCE and others. Oversized materials would be maps, drawings, everything that doesn't fit in the normal archival storage boxes. And then oral histories that were done with him. I'll get to that in a minute. So if you go to his research files, you will see things that he collected, subseries on bridges, waterways, industrial structures, engineers, general historical topics, historic buildings, and building materials. And then there's a subsection on bridges. So covered bridges, suspension bridges, whatever. This is, if you're not familiar with the way archival files are organized, this is a good example of what you'd find. Here's the material on the covered bridge restoration projects. Fish Creek, Hearns Mill, Hoax Mill, Indian Creek, Laurel Creek, Locust Creek, etc. These are the oral history files. In 2017 and 2018, I did a series of interviews with Emory. We probably talked for a total of 7 or 8 hours over time and organized them in different categories. It was just too much to do everything at once. So, and then there are notes on the projects that I did with them. There were other oral histories that were done also at various times, and they're part of this file. This is a chart that's part of the file that I did as part of the oral histories to try to get some handle on all the work that he had done. So Tiger Dam, Tenn-Tom Waterway in Tennessee, then of course the Royal Marines and the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. So it was all over the country, all over the world. The records are also there of the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology as a separate collection. So this is the scope and contents of that collection. You'll see a lot about the Civilian Conservation Corps there because Larry Seipold in particular was very interested in the CCC. So some of his records are in there, I think. And this is a contents list for the CCC, but then you get down to the Morgantown Historic Landmarks. It says council, it should be commission. This is all part of the IHTIA, and this link will be part of what Danielle sends you if you're interested. Now, the WVU libraries are closed, I understand, through the summer, so you can take a look at all this and figure out what you might like to see when you can get to Morgantown. And as a result of Emory's donation of all these records, there was an exhibit put together of his work that opened up last May and ran at the WVU library all summer. I want to thank the AmeriCorps members, Samuel Richardson, Alana Natanson, and Dr. Connie Evans, who have been working on these papers for the past couple of years to try to get them so well organized. Here's Emory speaking at the opening of that exhibit at the WVU libraries. John Cuthbert on the left is the director of the libraries, and Lori Hostetler on the right with the orange shirt is the assistant director, runs the day-to-day operations at the West Virginia Regional History Center. It is on the 6th floor of the WVU libraries, the old downtown library. And if they ever reopen, when they reopen, you will be welcome to go and use these records. So Emory and Janet gave an endowment to help the preservation of these records and to fund the preservation and use of these records in something like exhibits in the future. So this was probably Emory's last big public event last May. He received a number of awards over his career. This is a very, very short list, but I must start with the obelisk because there is an obelisk somewhere in France that says every great engineer, that says it's an obelisk to honor an engineer. I think it's at a bridge. I'm not quite sure where. Emory told his students one too many times that every great engineer needs an obelisk. And therefore, Elizabeth Nolan, now Elizabeth Nolan Pickett, designed and built this obelisk and got it down to Woodburn Hall, where Emory's office was. And Janet, as a classics scholar, wrote the text, which says an obelisk is the need of every great engineer. So that's nobody remembers what happened to the obelisk. It was around for quite a long time, but it has disappeared somewhere. But the plaque still exists and was highlighted at his memorial service. He received the Doherty Award from the West Virginia Humanities Council, a distinguished member of ASCE. That's was one of his most prized awards. The General Tools Award, the first one from the Society for Industrial Archaeology for his work with that group, an honor award from the National Trust, and an award of merit from the AASLH, and all kinds of others that I could tell you. In 2011, he got the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Preservation Alliance. Actually, PA had honored him in Beverly many years earlier at one of our first meetings, I think down in Bluefield, so 82, 83, very early in the process. And then in 2012, the award was renamed for him. So as I say, he died January 20th. He had gone in for surgery on Wednesday before that. The surgery was successful, but his heart was not in good shape, hadn't been for a long time. Went into medical ICU and passed away on Monday. He would not have wanted to live in the condition he was in at the time. So thank you to Christopher Marston and David Simmons for this beautiful obituary and the SIA newsletter. And thank you to Billy Joe Payton for this obituary in the newsletter of the International Committee for the Conservation of Industrial Heritage. And I do want to acknowledge people who have worked and are still working in the state. Mike Kaplinger, I worked with him on the Morgantown early water supply including work at the Botanic Garden, B&O Railroad, Thurman Passenger Depots, Billy Joe and his work with the New River his dissertation on the Cumberland Road or National Road, Mike Workman on the Northern West Virginia coal fields with Paul Sahlstrom and Phil Ross. So that's a very small list. Billy Joe and Mike are still doing, Workman are still doing great work down at West Virginia State. And at this point, Danielle, I will turn it over to you. If there are questions, we'll see what we can do with them.
Thank you so much, Barb. That was excellent. So if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to submit those in the chat box, or if they want to raise a hand and ask them over the audio, that would be fine as well. We'll just give it a few minutes here. Well, I haven't had any questions come in yet. So I guess we can just, oh, here we go. Here comes one. Does the University of Illinois recognize his achievements?
Ah, good question. They did when he graduated. The first time he got the Outstanding Civil Engineering Award the year that he got his bachelor's degree. I don't know if there's been anything since then. I'll have to check that out with Janet.
Another person has asked that, did Emory have any involvement with the Etnaville Bridge in Wheeling?
The Etnaville Bridge?
Etnav, yes, Aetnaville. I don't think I ever say that right. Etnaville.
Not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean he didn't, but it's not one I heard him talk about. The only one he ever really talked about much was the suspension bridge. And maybe, you know, he probably worked a little bit on the back channel bridge, but I don't remember the other one.
Yes, we had one person who had asked that question say that it is endangered. So the Department of Highways is to tear it down unless some organization will step forward to have a preservation plan and to take that bridge on for its restoration.
Well, yeah, there were always the issues of who's going to take this, and the highway department was, I think, often quite willing to let somebody take over a covered bridge and get it off the highway system and, you know, make it pedestrian only or bike only or something like that. Emory wasn't very involved. If it's something that happened in the last couple of years, he really had kind of stopped being involved by that time.
Another question has come in. I noticed there was a gap in his career between being a private civil engineer and starting WVU. So what would he have been doing during that time period?
In the 50s? In the 50s, he was working for, while he was in London, he was working with engineering firms, consulting firms in London. He goes to London in 1953, 54, and he's there until he starts back at Illinois in 1959. So for those years of the late 50s, he's working for construction engineering firms in London. The Opera House is the most important of the projects, but he also worked on a hangar for the Royal Air Force that was a concrete shell. And of course, a concrete shell, to put a plane under it, has to be huge. and he designed the shell and then also the supports for that shell that all, of course, had to be jacked up at the same time so that the thing didn't crack. So that was another one of his famous projects. But he was working for a variety of engineering firms. The most important one was Arup, and studying and getting his degree.
Next question is, what brought his attention to West Virginia and WVU?
Well, he was looking for a job, and I think there was a connection between somebody he might have been working with at Illinois and somebody at WVU. I'd have to go back and think about the oral history with that. I'm sure I asked him. He was getting his degree in structural mechanics. WVU wanted his engineering program was gearing up. The building was brand new, and they wanted somebody to develop the structures program. And of course, in the early 60s, this is a time when the academy is really coming to a point where a PhD is really, really important. So looking for somebody with a PhD, and the network is very, very small. Illinois, I mean, still is, but even smaller then. Emory would build the structures lab at WVU. He would hire a number of people who are still there, like Hoda Gangaral, who worked with him on bridge projects and is still there teaching structures. My neighbor Larry Luttrell he'll hire, and others that have long careers at WVU. But I think it was some personal connection between someone in Illinois, and that's the way it worked at the time. You know, WVU would call up somebody and say, do you have anybody we could hire? Or Illinois would call up their friends and say, hey, we've got somebody, can you hire him? Not a very complicated hiring process compared to what it is now.
The next question that came in asked whether the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia remains in contact with hair folks that Emory introduced to the state. Does that interest remain, and what are future hair plans and ideas for documenting and content creation in this region? We have, I mean, through what I've done in the last 8 years, we've not had contacts with the hair folks, but that could be something that we put down on a list of, you know, future outreach, and is a really good idea to understand what kind of content and maybe ways that we can support those projects.
Well, Christopher Marston, who is one of the chief people at HAIR, I don't remember his exact title, was at Emory's memorial service in February and co-wrote that obituary at the SIA newsletter. So he would be a good contact for Preservation Alliance. He's in Washington.
Okay, thanks, Barb. What was his name again?
Christopher Marston, Marston. Billy Joe Payton knows him. I met him at the memorial. He's been very interested in Emory's work. He helped me figure out all the stuff that Emory had done for hair. The hair records are at the Library of Congress. I guess I should have mentioned that. If anybody's interested, you can go to the Library of Congress and Google through the hair records.
So that's pretty much all that we have right now. Just give it a few more moments to see if any other questions come in. Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to Barb for putting together this wonderful presentation to preserve the memory of Dr. Kemp and all of his important work that he did for our state. And this information will be available online for free that you can share with friends and relatives and anyone else you think who may be interested. And we'll continue to be providing these free webinars throughout the summer. If anyone is interested in signing up for others, the information is on our website. And we hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.